SEP FanFic Readings presents My True Love Gave to Me by Notebook and Ink. Chapter 8. Frosty the Abominable Snowman. December 2003. After he received the letter from Hermione saying she was going to Asia, Draco was so angry he completely destroyed his office. Luckily, when he'd redone the room, he'd had enough forethought to put protective spells on all the bookcases, but the same could not be said for his loose papers and furniture. They sat in shreds, scraps, and stuffing scattered about the room. And he'd sent off a very turbulent letter without thinking. A few days later, when it came back, he was awash with relief. Then the only thing he could do was wait for any scrap of news she might send. He wasn't willing to let her go just yet, no matter if she said he should. Draco spent half the year going mad with worry. Yet, unless you were behind closed doors with him, you would hardly have guessed it. He got up, went about his morning routine, went to work, and began courting Astoria Greengrass, for his mother's sake. He continued to play his part to perfection, just as he had been for the last 3 years. He didn't mind Astoria, and she was better than some of the women he'd been forced into dates with. She was fairly smart, courteous, and everything a pureblood society wife was meant to be, thanks to extensive finishing classes. The two of them just didn't have the same spark he'd become accustomed to, the spark that now was all he craved. The biggest difference in life was now his nights. Sleep eluded him daily, and after a month of tossing and turning with worry for Hermione, Draco found the best way to be rid of it was exercise. He had a home gym installed in the guest room of the townhouse, so when the intrusive thoughts of her in pain or pleasure with someone else would not let him rest, it was there he would retreat. He would train with such frenzy until he was so physically exhausted there was no possible way his anxious mind could keep him awake. When he would get a small note from her, the worry would lessen for a while, but then the long stretches of nothing would resume, and he would be right back where he started. The Cruciatus curse seemed more humane some days. After a few months, those around him seemed to notice that his physical appearance had changed. He was leaner around the middle and broader in the shoulders. His legs were thicker and his muscles more toned overall. The most annoying part about the change was that he'd had to have all his suits taken in for measurement adjustments, as well as the constant comments from Theo about how much he wished they hadn't known each other all their lives, so he could appreciate Draco's new body properly. A few days before the Christmas party, Draco received a note from Hermione saying she wouldn't be back in England for Christmas. Later that day, Theo found him at home in the gym again. "Daphne told me you'd cancelled your dinner plans with Astoria," Theo said as he crossed the room to lean against the wall near the rowing machine Draco was currently occupying. "Did you get something from Granger? Is she back in town?" Draco continued to row angrily. He'd been at it for some time, and the sweat was glistening off his bare, rippling back muscles. "She's not coming home," he replied with a grunt as he pulled on the handlebar. "She's busy." Theo frowned. He was the only one who knew about what Draco really had been going through for the past year, and the dance he and Hermione seemed to be doing. He'd been surprisingly supportive. Everyone else just assumed Draco was happy, and would be proposing to Astoria sometime in the new year. "Hey, at least you heard from her." Theo could always be counted on to try and find the silver lining. "It's been what, 2 months?" "Something like that," Draco grunted again. 6 weeks and 4 days, to be specific. Not the longest time he'd gone without news, but definitely the most disappointing when it arrived. "Would you stop?" Theo shouted. "You're going to sweat this room into a swimming pool, and I am trying to have a conversation with you." Draco rolled his eyes and finished his set, then put his feet back on the floor. He reached for the towel at the foot of the machine and wiped the sweat from his face and his hair. "What?" he sighed, exasperated. "Am I supposed to be happy that I got some scrap of news?" "You're supposed to be grateful that she's at least still alive, you prick." Theo rolled his eyes and then crossed his arms. "I know you miss her, man, but she's doing something she believes is important. Which she's right, by the way, it is." "You think I don't know that?" Draco growled. He'd spent too many days pissed off at himself for donating the money that led to all of this in the first place. But not once did any of the soliloquizing about it ever once come back to a point that wasn't just that. It was important, and she was making a difference. "What kind of a man are you if you can't put your selfishness aside and support her? It makes you no better than Weasley. You saw how well that worked out for him," the brown-haired wizard admonished him. Though he'd never use the words, for fear of boosting his ego even further into the stratosphere, Theo was right. Draco should be happy enough to know that she was still alive. He was just having difficulty coming to terms with the fact that he hadn't seen and barely spoken to the witch he was in love with for almost a year, and now his chance to do so had been ripped away without warning. Not to mention, said witch currently thought he was in the process of trying to court and marry another. "You're not wrong," Draco sighed, his anger subsiding. Then he got up from the machine to wipe it down. "It's just that I had plans, things I wanted to say and do while she was here." "So she won't be coming home for Christmas. Maybe she'll at least be coming back soon, and you can say and do it all then," Theo countered. Draco just huffed in response. He'd been hoping she'd be coming back soon for months, and all it had gotten him was a new body and frown lines in his forehead. "Are you still coming out with us tomorrow night?" Theo asked. "Why wouldn't I?" Draco strode over to the side table where his water bottle sat and took a drink. Theo pushed himself off the wall and shrugged. "I didn't know how long you planned to stay up here and brood." "I don't brood." His eyes narrowed at his friend, his tone dripped with annoyance. "Sure you don't." The pub was packed, so Draco had taken upon himself to be the one to head up to the bar anytime someone needed another round. He didn't particularly want the girls to try and slither through the crowd and risk getting crushed or fondled. He had a much easier time getting people out of his way these days. "Here you go," he called out as he set down a tray with everyone's refills onto the table of the corner of the booth. Once everyone had taken their drinks, Draco grabbed his own glass and sat down on the outer edge of the booth next to Daphne, then waved his hand to send the tray back to the bar. His friends all mumbled their thanks for the third round, then went back to their individual conversations. "Why'd you cancel on my sister last night?" Daphne prompted, then took a sip of her glass. Draco paused, his own glass halfway between the table and his mouth. "Something came up," he offered, then finished his swig. "That's not much of an answer." She narrowed her eyes at him. "What do you want me to say, Daph? I couldn't make it, and I apologized to her for the short notice." "I want you to promise me that you're not messing around on her. She's still young, Draco. She doesn't really understand what it is to be in an adult relationship," she chided. Draco knew for a fact that this was incorrect, and Astoria knew exactly what it was to be an adult. The more time he'd spent with her over the last year, the more he'd realized that while she'd fit in with his mother's mold perfectly, Astoria wanted to enjoy her youth and beauty, and all the young wizards that came with it. In the beginning, it seemed like she only went out with him to appease their parents, although along the way it was growing more apparent that she was under the impression they'd be married someday. After they'd gotten married, Daphne's worldview seemed to have gone a little rose-tinted, but he'd known for a while about all the rumors that her husband Roger had been sneaking around behind her back. Draco had always known he would. Roger was a flubberworm through and through. Draco laughed dryly. "And we both know so much at the ripe old age of 23. "I'm serious, Draco." She had to be projecting her own insecurities on the relationship he had with her sister. Though it was true Draco wasn't in love with Astoria, he wasn't cheating on her. "So am I. We're all still young and figuring things out. How's Roger, Daph?" It was a low blow, and as soon as he said it he regretted it, because Daphne's face quickly fell into sadness. "Shit, I'm sorry, Daph. I shouldn't have said that." He apologized and looked down into her shining eyes. "I don't want to fight with you, okay? I got some bad news, so I went home to let off some steam. That's it, I promise." Daphne just nodded. Draco quickly pulled her into his side. He felt terrible for making her feel this way, and he needed to fix it. "Tell you what, next time I see your husband, I'll bind and abduct him so you can throw any curse you want at him, and I'll grease whoever's palm to make sure you don't get in any trouble for it, if you use an unforgivable. Does that sound good?" A small smile came to her lips, and she sniffled and rubbed her nose with the sleeve of her sweater. "What sounds good?" Theo butt in. He and Pansy were both now looking in their direction from across the table. "Kidnapping Roger," Draco answered, which seemed to get Blaze and Millie's attention as well. "Ooh, yes, please." Pansy raised her glass of red wine. "I've got just the place to keep him," Blaze chimed in. "I call dibs on the second curse," Tracy added. Daphne began to laugh, and Draco lightly squeezed her shoulders. The Slytherins protected their own. "I love it when a plan comes together," Theo smirked. "Who has the best place to hide a body?" The next afternoon, Draco arrived at the manor trying his best to stave off a sour mood. There really were only 2 adequate options for his evening. He could sulk in self-pity and drink the night away, most likely putting a damper on the party. Or he could put on a happy face for his mother and try to enjoy the night with his friends. In his ensuite, Draco took a lengthy shower before dressing in his freshly tailored tux. He was standing in front of the floor-length mirror, adjusting his bow tie, when there was a knock on his door. He waved a hand and could hear it open to let in his guest. "Draco, dear, it's just me," his mother called. On his way out to the bedroom, Draco grabbed his cufflinks out of their drawer and put them on one by one as he walked. "Hello, Mother," he greeted her. The Malfoy matriarch was dressed in black robes made of fine silk that had a rather ornate gold collar. Her hair was twisted back in a slick French roll with not a strand out of place, as per usual. "Oh, good, you're ready," she smiled. "I was afraid I was going to have to drag you into that closet myself." "Have I ever not been ready on time?" He smiled back and pushed a hand through his hair. Narcissa breathed a laugh. "There was a time when you wouldn't be, yes, but I suppose that's been many years ago now." She reminisced with a dreamy, far-off look. "Do you need help with something, Mother?" he asked, pulling her back to the present. "Oh, no, dear." She shook her head and clasped her hands in front of her. "Everything has been handled. Pansy is downstairs threatening the waitstaff of all things." "Of course she is," Draco replied dryly and rolled his eyes. The blonde woman walked over and sat at the edge of his bed, then looked around his room with a sigh. "I just wanted to come up and see how you're doing. Though you may think so, it hasn't escaped my notice that you've been struggling this past year." "I'm fine, Mother," he said, and walked over to sit down next to her. "Well, I was just wondering if maybe it was because you've been nervous about fulfilling a certain family duty we had discussed." Draco turned to look at her, his brow lifted in suspicion. Narcissa pulled a small velvet box out of her pocket, and Draco wondered how he could have missed that she was wearing a completely different ring that he was used to seeing. His mother took his hand and turned it over, then placed the box in his palm. "Do you think you'll be needing this soon?" Draco looked down at the box and let out a small sigh. He'd had an inkling that this would be coming soon, but he didn't expect it that day. When his eyes flicked back to his mother's face, she was smiling, and Draco felt his stomach begin to tighten. He didn't want to ruin her hope for the future, after everything she'd had to endure in the past. That was something he'd never been able to do, which was why his life was in the current state. "I don't know," he said simply. "Astoria is a nice girl, and she's well brought up. She has all the makings of a good wife, and the 2 of you do seem to get along well," she stated her case. "Yes, Mother," was all he said. He didn't want to start a fight on her big night. "I don't want you to feel like I'm forcing you into anything. I just thought I'd put in my 2 knuts." His mother then patted his knee twice before she stood up and crossed the room to his door. "I'll see you downstairs." After she was gone, Draco popped the box open and looked down at the elegant ring his mother had been wearing since the day she married his father. A 3-carat, marquise-cut stone haloed in gold band. For Astoria, it would be perfect. For the person he truly wanted to give a ring, it would never suffice. It was too over the top, and she would prefer something much simpler. Draco snapped the box shut, stood up, strode over to his nightstand, and tossed it in the drawer. The manor's ballroom was once again extravagantly decorated, but this year in black and gold for their masquerade ball. Guests adorned in masks sat at tables covered with black silk linens, on which sat gold place settings and large feather centerpieces. Others milled about the edges of the room, taking in the sparkling gold Christmas trees with black glass ornaments and elaborate mirrored stars on top. Waiters in black suits with intricate gold masks carried trays of hors d'oeuvres and drinks throughout the mingling guests. The ceilings had been enchanted to portray the cloudless night sky sitting just beyond it, within which twinkled millions of stars. Draco and his mother, donning their matching gold masks, entered the ballroom arm in arm to a round of applause from their guests. His mother beamed and nodded to individuals as he led her to the stage with the awaiting band. Narcissa gave her welcome speech and invited the guests to sit down, before Draco then led them back to their own table. Awaiting them there were the Greengrasses, Astoria and her parents, as well as Daphne and Roger. Theo's chair was noticeably empty. While Draco pulled a chair out for his mother to take her seat, he He glanced between Roger and Daphne, who was looking back at him with a contrite smile. Draco gave her a knowing nod, and plastered on a smile of his own while he took his seat next to Astoria. Their meal passed in seemingly polite conversation about unimportant topics. As it dragged on, Draco could suddenly see his future if he decided to marry Astoria. He'd be sitting in rooms just like this, around tables with these people nursing multiple glasses of fire whiskey and actively monitoring his facial expressions. Something he was having to do this very evening every time Roger opened his mouth, or Astoria attempted to hold his hand. After her fourth attempt went unrequited, and their parents seemed to be eyeing them both, Draco gave in. Soon dessert was served, after which the staff began clearing most of the tables from the room, leaving a few in the back, and guests were left to indulge in either drinks from the bar or champagne flutes from waiters milling about. As everyone mingled, Draco nabbed 2 champagne flutes from a passing tray, then made his way back over to Daphne. "Here you go, Daph." He smiled as he handed her the bubbling glass. "Thanks," she smiled up at him. Roger, who was standing next to his wife, scowled at him. "Oh, so sorry, Rog. I forgot you were here." Draco smirked as he took a drink of his own glass. "I'm sure if you head up to the bar, they'll probably be able to get you whatever you like." Roger rolled his eyes and walked off with a scoff. "Why is he here?" Draco leaned in to whisper to his friend. "He showed up at my parents' house late last night," she replied. "They don't know about anything, so we've had to put on this big show." Draco nodded and looked out amongst the crowd, then noticed Astoria and his mother were coming their way. "Well, just give me a signal, and I'll set the plan in motion," he winked. Daphne laughed emphatically, and Draco smiled. "Speaking of, have you seen Theo anywhere?" "What's so funny?" her sister asked with a wide smile as she finally approached. "Oh, nothing," Draco answered. "And no, Daph, I haven't seen him, but he'll probably turn up soon. It's not like him to miss a party." Her sister reached her hand out to him. "Come, dear, it is time for us to start dancing." Draco tossed back the rest of his champagne flute and placed it on a passing tray, then took his mother's hand to lead her out to the middle of the now open floor. As soon as they were in position, the band started up and Draco led her into a waltz, and together they spun around the dance floor surrounded by onlooking guests. As the music swelled and they spun once more, a sparkle of light from the other end of the large room caught Draco's eye. He turned his head to see Theo's signature mauve tux coming down the staircase near the fireplace, and he was supporting the arm of a slight woman wearing a glittering golden gown and matching matte black mask. Draco and his mother turned and turned in their dance, but he kept on swiveling his head to let his eyes track the pair until they hit the bottom of the stairs and disappeared into the crowd. Finally, the song ended, and Draco brought them to a halt. He gave his mother a small bow and was about to walk off to find Theo when Astoria stepped in front of him in her poofy emerald green ball gown with a wide smile. The band started the next song, and when Draco did nothing but stare at her, Astoria's smile fell to a look of concern. "Draco?" she whispered swiftly. He blinked a few times, then took her waist and began to spin her around the floor. As other guests joined them, Astoria smiled at everyone just as widely as his mother had. She'd been right. Astoria was made for this life, and she enjoyed it. The music played on, and Draco continued to scan the room for Theo's pop of color as he spun Astoria around. Finally, he spotted him on the outer edge near the bar. "Are you all right?" Astoria leaned in and whispered. Draco looked down at her. "I'm fine. Dancing just isn't my favorite pastime." "Well, I'm sure we'll have to dance a few more times tonight. Make sure you don't drink too much. You don't want to look sloppy to our guests." Draco's jaw clenched, and it took quite a bit of effort for him not to roll his eyes at her use of "our." So when the song started to wind down, he deposited Astoria back along the side of the room a few bars before it was even completely finished. Then he slipped off into the crowd without looking back to see her reaction, which he was sure was some shade of indignant. He made his way towards the bar, the last place he'd caught a glimpse of his tardy friend, and when he reached it, Theo was standing behind his date with his back turned towards him. "Being perpetually fashionably late is not a virtue you should aspire to, not?" he chided his friend. "I'm going to ignore that," Theo said as he turned around with a drink in his hand. "Just the wizard I was hoping to see," he grinned. "Why are you looking for me?" Draco's brow peaked. "I was on time." I was hoping you might be willing to take my date for a spin around the dance floor. I think I might have twisted my ankle last night, and I don't want to aggravate it," he explained. Draco sighed. He was already 2 dances deeper than he'd wanted to be that evening. But when Theo stepped aside and brought the young woman around between them, he was suddenly struck dumb. Though she was wearing a mask, and her charmed blonde hair was twisted into an elaborate updo, he would know those soft brown eyes and supple smiling lips anywhere. He was sure his face was a picture of utter shock. Hermione smiled wide and laughed. "Great!" Theo picked up Hermione's hand and put it in Draco's. "You're doing me a huge favor, my friend. This one loves to dance," he said a little louder than necessary. At the touch of her hand, Draco felt himself relax fully for the first time in a year. "It's my pleasure, Theo." He addressed the wizard, but couldn't take his eyes off the witch. "Off with you, then!" Theo smirked and shooed them towards the dance floor. Draco led Hermione through the crowd and tightened his grip on her hand like she would dissipate into smoke if he didn't. When they reached the edge of the dance floor, the band was just finishing up their latest song, so he led her straight out. He took her waist, pulled her in as close as was appropriate for a taken host and his guest. There were still quite a few eyes on him in this ballroom, so he put on as stoic mask as he could muster. "You're not supposed to be here," he pressed in and whispered as he took the first step of the waltz. "I can leave." She looked up at him with a smile that went all the way to her eyes. Draco breathed a laugh and spun them around so her dress flared out at the bottom. "Now that I have you here, I wish you luck with that endeavor," he replied. "So what changed?" "After I sent you the note, we caught a break with our case and finished up before we had planned. I caught the next portkey back," she explained. "So you went to Theo?" He lifted a brow. "Why didn't you go to see your parents, or the Potters?" "Well, Harry and Ginny are so busy with the baby, probably why they aren't here tonight, and I will go see my parents tomorrow. But I wanted to surprise you first." "Well, you did something most people can't, and you can count me thoroughly surprised." "You should have seen the look on your face," she giggled. "It's still lingering, actually." As he twirled them again, Draco could hear whispers among the crowd begin to form, and he realized he'd subconsciously moved his hand further down Hermione's back, near to her arse. He looked around as they moved through the dance space and noticed his mother, Astoria, and her parents looking at the pair of them from the sidelines. All of them shared the same look, as if they were trying to decipher who this mystery witch could be and why he was pressed so closely to her. Draco looked back at Hermione, and a third option for the evening presented itself in his mind. However, since he would definitely be missed at the party, he would need Theo's help to make it happen. The song was winding down, so it was now or never. He moved his hand back up to a more appropriate place in the middle of her back. "I am thrilled to have you here, Hermione. Really, I am. But if anyone finds out it's you under there, I won't be able to keep you all to myself," Draco said. "Once the song is over, we'll need to bow and part ways. Head back to Theo and tell him the pixies are out of the cage. He'll know what it means and what he should do." Hermione nodded in understanding, just as the song's last chord played out. They stepped apart, she curtsied, and he bowed. Then they both turned in opposite directions and exited the dance floor without haste. Draco strode over and stood between his mother and Astoria, prepared to maintain his stoic demeanor. "Who was that, darling?" his mother asked with a small smile. "Theo's date," Draco stated. "You didn't catch a name?" she pressed. "No, Theo just said he hurt himself and asked if I would share a dance with her." "Well, that was very kind of you, dear," Narcissa replied sweetly. "Yes, very kind," Astoria chimed in with a look less than pleased. Draco wrapped an arm behind Astoria's waist. "It's all about being a good host, isn't it?" he replied. Astoria was opening her mouth to retort, but Theo appeared in front of them and interrupted. "Excellent party, Mrs. Malfoy, as always." He reached for Narcissa's waist and leaned in to kiss her cheek. "Thank you, Theodore," she reciprocated. "Draco was just telling us about your injury." Theo waved away the concern. "Oh, it's nothing that won't heal in a day or two with rest. I just came over to say a quick good night before I head out." "Where's your date?" Astoria butted in. "We'd all love to meet her." "In the powder room, I'm afraid." Theo smiled sweetly at her. "I think the combination of drinks and spinning of the waltz made her a bit nauseous. I told her I'd say my goodbyes, then we'd depart." Poor thing, Narcissa frowned. As for you, do try to stay out of trouble between now and Christmas. We'll see you promptly at 8 for breakfast. Narcissa smiled at him. I'll walk you out and make my apologies, Draco said. Theo nodded, and Draco dropped his hand from Astoria's waist. Then the two wizards made their way out of the ballroom without a backwards glance. The pair were just about to open the false wall that led into their favorite childhood hiding place when they heard shouting coming down the hall towards them. It was Daphne and Roger, and she rounded the corner first. Oh! She stopped dead in her tracks. Roger was hot on her heels and almost ran into her as he too came around the corner. His face fell from anger into disgust, and Draco reciprocated wholeheartedly. He was sure Theo was doing the same. I'll see you back in the ballroom. Roger inclined his head to Daphne before storming off. Daphne quickly swiped the heel of her hand across her cheek to rid any evidence of crying. What are you two up to? She deflected. We could ask you the same thing, Theo probed. I was going out to get some air, she started. She must have known they wouldn't stop until they got the truth, so it was better to just come out with it off the bat. Roger followed me, and we had an argument, that's all. What about? Draco asked, trying to remain calm. He'd had about enough of the playboy wizard toying with one of his best friends. I told him I want a divorce, she admitted. He says he doesn't, but I think he just doesn't want to give up the lifestyle he's been able to cultivate out of my family's money in the last few years. More than likely, Theo rolled his eyes. Don't let him try to change your mind, Daph. If it's what you really want, make it happen. We're all here for you, Draco added. Thanks, she smiled brightly to each of them, then grew stern. So, are you going to answer my initial question, or do I have to ask it again? We have some business I'd like to discuss, Draco lied easily. We're just heading up to my study for a quick conversation, and then Theo was going to head out for the evening. Theo smiled in agreement with the lie they were baiting. Okay, well, hurry back down, Draco. My sister won't shut up about how many dances she wants to be seen doing tonight, and I've already grown tired of listening to her. I'll try, he nodded. Daphne sidestepped them and headed off down the hallway. Once she was out of sight around another corner, Theo mimed wiping and flicking sweat off his brow with a whistle. Draco shook his head as he pressed the panel and opened up the wall. It led into a secret passageway that wound its way through the house to many locations, one of which being Draco's study. They'd spent hours going through it when they were children. He looked side to side to make sure there was no one else around to see them, then ducked inside. When he opened the wall on the other end, he found Hermione trailing her fingers over the spines of his rare books, her hair back to its normal color. He took a second to absorb the moment and the look of her in her beautiful dress without her mask, for he knew time with her was fleeting. Hello. She turned and smiled softly at him when Theo clicked the panel shut behind them. Draco crossed the room in as few steps as possible and swiftly gathered her into his arms. He buried his face in her hair and breathed in her scent deeply while she nestled into him, pressing a kiss to her temple. It was clear to him that no other witch would ever compare, and he never wanted to be apart from her for the rest of his life. All right, Theo piped up. Before you two get really inappropriate, can I hear thank you, Theo? Draco straightened up but didn't dare let go of his favorite witch. The polyjuice and hair is in the top locked drawer of my desk. If anyone comes up, you know what to do. Draco noticed Hermione's brow was peaked and knew she'd be asking him about it later. And the good booze? Theo cocked his head. Draco reached in his pocket and tossed Theo a ring of small keys, one each for the desk and the good liquor cabinet, among other things. Don't go too crazy, he warned. Same to you, the jovial wizard winked. Thank you, Theo, Hermione added genuinely. Draco reached down and took her hand, leading her over to the fireplace. He grabbed a handful of flue powder off the mantel, called out for the Mayfair townhouse, and the pair stepped through the green flames together. They were barely through the other side before Draco tugged her back into his arms and planted a deep kiss on her lips. They stayed pressed together, soaking in each other's presence for a fair few minutes. Finally, Hermione pulled away and looked up at him through lashes. Her smile widened before she reached up to the back of his head and pulled on his black silk ribbon, keeping his mask on tight in place. He'd been so focused on getting her alone for the past half hour that he'd completely forgotten he'd been wearing it. There you are, she said as it fell away. Draco smiled and gazed down into her eyes once more. He'd do it forever if she'd let him. "So," she began, and he rolled his eyes playfully at the list of questions he knew she was sure to ask now. "What's with the pixie thing?" Draco breathed a laugh. "Do you remember in their second year when Lockhart let all those pixies loose in Dada class?" "Yes." "Well, when everyone else was focused on them, a young group of ne'er-do-well Slytherin boys might have snuck off to do ne'er-do-well things," he answered. "It sort of became our little signal for when we wanted to sneak off, especially from boring Christmas parties, but needed some type of distraction or help." "Oh," she smiled. "That's quite clever." "Mm-hmm." Draco leaned in to press his lips to hers once more, now craving the contact, but she leaned back and pressed her palm to his mouth instead. "And the polyjuice potion? Why do you keep it in your desk?" She tilted her head, then removed her hand so he could answer. "Old habit," he shrugged. "After Voldemort returned, and I was given my task, my mother made me keep some on me at all times. She was worried he would want to kill me for the slightest reasons, which her intuition wasn't unfounded, as it turned out. She wanted me to be able to get away if I needed to." "And when you said Theo would know what to do?" she asked. "Oh, he's been me before. The summer before 8th year, my mother kept me on a pretty short leash for fear of reprisals. I was barely allowed to leave the manor, so if I wanted to go out, we'd swap bodies for a few hours." Draco shifted her in her arms. "He doesn't mind being me. I think he likes it, actually. He gets to have some time with a maternal figure, something he sorely missed since his mother passed long ago. I bet you 10 galleons he goes back to the party and dances with my mother at least 2 more times." "You don't think they'd notice that it's not really you?" "No. He says I'm extremely easy to impersonate." "That's kind of creepy," she replied. "I feel like I'm going to need a safety question." Draco chuckled. "Not necessary. He only does it if I ask him, and this is the first time in a long time." "I still might think of one regardless." "Whatever makes you happy," he smirked. "May I please kiss you now?" "Oh," she cried out. "Yes, I'm so sorry. You know how I can—" He cut her off with a languid and passionate kiss. "So, do you want the tour now, or after?" "After what?" Her brow raised. Hermione squealed as Draco bent down and hauled her up over his shoulder, then laughed her protestations as he carried her out of the drawing room, through the foyer, and up the stairs, then down the hallway to his bedroom. It was nearly impossible to keep his hands from roaming around the back of her thighs and up around her backside, feeling the silky smooth fabric of her dress underneath his palm. Hands busy, Draco pushed the door open with his foot, and strode across the room to deposit her onto the fluffy down duvet. He followed after her, climbing up onto the bed to hover over her, a lecherous glint in his eyes, while he pushed her hair back out of her face. "I didn't have time to get you a present," she breathed. "I barely packed any clothes." "Are you kidding?" he replied with a wolfish grin. "You're in my bed, and very quickly about to be without a dress. That is quite possibly the best present you could ever give me." Draco's head lay on one of the only overstuffed pillows to have survived the night in the same place it started. One arm was behind his head, and Hermione was tucked under the other, nestled against his chest. A contented feeling seeped into his bones, and he could feel sleep attempting to cement his eyelids closed. Then a chilling sensation ran up his left arm, then down his spine. Hermione was tracing his dark mark with her fingertip. Draco shifted his right arm from behind his head and brought his hand down to gently grab her wrist. He interlocked his fingers with hers, brought the back of her hand to his mouth to press a kiss, then laid them down on his chest. She breathed a heavy sigh. "I've been meaning to ask you about it since that day in the cafe, but I didn't know how to go about it exactly," she said softly. "What do you want to know?" he asked quietly. "Why do you still have it?" "It will fade a little with time, but it won't ever go away. It's also not possible to cover it up or remove it. I tried. Voldemort made sure it was part of the spell to put them on. He didn't want his followers to ever be able to deny him." Draco took a shaky breath. He'd been dreading the possibility of this conversation since he first ran into her in the music shop. "Although it doesn't feel like it used to anymore," he conceded. "What did it used to feel like?" She shifted. Draco leaned down and placed a tentative kiss on the top of her head. When I first got it, it burned badly. I didn't know if it was supposed to, so I tried my best to hide the pain. Later on, after speaking with my father, I knew that it wasn't, so I think perhaps my body was rejecting it. I don't know for sure. He took another breath. Anyway, after the burning faded, it felt like Voldemort was standing right behind me at all times, watching my every move. It was unnerving, to say the least. And seeing it wriggle about under my skin wasn't pleasant either. He waited for her to sit up and take off with revulsion, but she just lazily traced the bare skin of his chest with her fingertip. "You can't glamour it?" she asked. He could practically hear the cogs in her brain trying to shake off the stupor of sex to get back to their normal level of function. "I can," he stated, "but they don't last long. It's easier to just wear long sleeves, which I do most of the time anyway because of the suits." "That makes sense." She nuzzled into him. Her cogs must have given up. "Does it bother you?" He raised an eyebrow. "No," she replied quickly, then laced their fingers and sat up. "It might have used to, but now I know your heart, Draco. A scar isn't going to change that." "It's a little more than just a scar." He shifted and he put his arm behind his head to hide the mark in question. "Most people don't sneer at plain old scars." Her brown eyes pierced into his gray ones for a long moment, her face having become very serious. "Well, I'm not most people," she said, then finally settled back into her place at his side before yawning. "You were right, by the way," she said sleepily. "Oh?" His brow raised. "What about?" "If you give it a minute, it does come naturally." A breath of a laugh escaped him before he leaned down and pressed a more assured kiss to the crown of her curls. After a few moments, he felt her breathing even out with deep, sated sleep. "I love you too, Hermione," he whispered, then let it take them as well. While short, it was the best sleep he'd had in months, probably years. Draco opened his eyes, and he was greeted with curly brown hair covering his face and itching his nose. In their dozing, Hermione had rolled away from him, so he reached out to wrap his arms around her middle and pull her back against his chest. At some point in the early morning, she must have gotten cold, for she'd put his white dress shirt on. It had never looked so good. "Merlin, I've missed you," he sighed into her curls. "I can tell," she said groggily. "And I'm sorry, by the way." "For what?" he asked, then nuzzled in to begin pressing kisses to her neck. "Mostly for the stress I can see you've been feeling. You put on a brave face last night, Draco, but Theo told me how you've been coping, which was blatantly obvious as soon as I set eyes on you last night." "Are you sorry you took the job in the first place?" he asked between sucks. "No," she replied, her breath starting to come quicker. "Then don't worry about me. Just enjoy the benefits." He continued his attentions. "Draco." She stirred as if she wanted to flip over to face him, so he tightened his grip and kept her in place. Hermione huffed. "So you can worry about me, but I can't worry about you." He stopped and released his grip so she could move freely how she wanted. "Theo and I have talked about this, and as much as it pains me to say it out loud, he's right. You're doing something important, and even though I want you all to myself, that's not realistic. Not when you are who you are." He reached up and caressed her jawline to tilt her head. "Now, can we please not fight, and just spend the time we have enjoying each other's company?" He planted a soft kiss on her lips. "When do you go back? After New Year's?" "Tomorrow," she said sheepishly and looked away. "Tomorrow?" Draco shot upright and almost leaped out of bed entirely, but not having any pants on kept him under the sheet. Hermione slowly sat up as well and leaned forward into his back, pressing a kiss to his taut shoulder muscles. "Tomorrow morning, to be specific." Draco was utterly speechless, yet scrubbed a hand over his face, then back through his hair in frustration. He was not expecting to have so little time with her, and it was taking quite a bit of energy to keep him planted where he was instead of storming off into the gym to work off his feelings. "Please say something," she prodded after a few minutes of silence. "Don't go back," he said quietly. Now was not the time for pride, not when he could be losing her yet again. "You're right. The last 6 months have been a torment. I honestly don't know if I can handle another 6, let alone a year." Draco, I have to. No, you don't, he interrupted. I will give Scamander all of my goddamn money if it means you'll stay. Hermione rubbed his tense shoulders and spoke in hushed tones, trying to soothe his building anger. Just before I left, we had the lead of a lifetime come in. It would be a huge win if we get this guy, and he's a big reason we're there in the first place, and they're waiting for me to go after him, she reasoned. I have to go back, but I don't want you to think that I wouldn't stay if I could. Yet, at the same time, I am trying to stop myself from saying too much, just in case things don't work out the way I want them to. Draco put his head in his hands. His heart was being both lifted and crushed at the same time. He was so happy to know that she had come to the same feelings for him, yet he would do anything to keep her from feeling the pain it was causing them both. So we've barely been together, and I'm out of time already. I can't convince you to stay today because you said you were going to see your parents. Yes, they're expecting me for dinner. I'd like it if you came with me, but I'll understand if you don't want to. Draco sighed and thought about it. He wanted to spend as much time with her as he could, and the little time they had. But what was the point in meeting her family if they were to continue on like this? I don't think that is a good idea. He turned around to face her. Hermione's face fell. Okay. Draco caressed her chin and tilted her face up to gaze into her soft brown eyes. I need to warn you that I don't know what the situation will be the next time you come back. My mother is adamant that I marry Astoria, and I don't know how much longer I can keep either of them at arm's length, especially when Astoria surprisingly seemed to be showing signs of a willingness to settle down. He could see the shining tears begin to gather around the edges of her eyes, and Draco could actually feel his heart crack. Once again, he gathered her into his arms, buried his face in her curls. D. Mission in 1 week. XOXO.